The Crusades. At the end of the 11th century, Europe was a fragmented world, but one thirsting for change. Feudal princes fought each other, peasants lived in poverty, and knights sought new paths to glory and wealth. The Catholic Church, led by the Pope in Rome, sought to strengthen its influence and unite Christian peoples. The significance of Jerusalem was a key factor. This city was a holy place for three religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For Christians, it was the center of their faith, the place of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. For Muslims, it was the city from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. For Jews, it was the legacy of the ancient Temple of Solomon. In the 11th century, Palestine was under Muslim rule. For a long time, pilgrims were able to visit the shrine without hindrance. But in the middle of the century, the Seljuks, Turkic conquerors, came to power in Asia Minor and the Middle East. They invaded Byzantium, defeated its army at Manzikert in 1071, and captured significant territories. Pilgrimage became unsafe, roads were blocked, and the shrine was threatened. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus turned to the West for help. He did not expect that the response would be not just military support, but an entire era of crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II spoke at the Council of Clermont. His speech became legendary. He spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians and of holy sites desecrated by infidels. He called on knights to end their internecine strife and turn their swords against the enemies of Christ. His words ignited hearts. The crowd shouted, "God wills it!" And this became the motto of the Crusades. The response exceeded all expectations. Thousands of people, knights, peasants, beggars, monks, set out on their journey. They were united by faith, a thirst for adventure, and the hope of forgiveness for their sins and riches. Thus began the First Crusade. The first to set out were crowds of poor people. This movement went down in history as the Peasants' Crusade. They set out without weapons or supplies, hoping for a miracle. Many died on the way, others pogromed Jewish communities in Europe, and still others reached Hungary and were destroyed there. The real army of crusaders gathered later. It was led by the knights of the largest feudal lords, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Tancred, and Hugh de Vermandois. Their troops were more disciplined, and they marched through Byzantium and Asia Minor, concluding agreements on joint action with Emperor Alexius. The journey was difficult. In Asia Minor, the Crusaders encountered the Seljuks. At the Battle of Dorylaeum, they were nearly destroyed, but they withstood the onslaught and won the victory. This success lifted their spirits and showed that the campaign had a chance of success. The Crusaders moved on, suffering from heat and hunger. In 1097, they approached Ansh, one of the key cities of Syria. The siege lasted for many months. People were dying of hunger, eating horses, and even grass. But the city fell when one of its defenders betrayed it and opened the gates. The Crusaders had barely had time to catch their breath when a huge Seljuk army approached the city. A new battle began. The Crusaders, exhausted and weakened, had almost lost hope. But faith and fanaticism gave them strength. They went outside the walls and delivered a decisive blow. The Seljuks fled. Ansh remained in the hands of the Crusaders. The way to Jerusalem was open. In 1099, the Crusaders approached the Holy City. Only about 20,000 remained from the original hundreds of thousands. The siege of Jerusalem was the culmination of the campaign. The city was well fortified, and the defenders were prepared to resist. The Crusaders built siege towers and catapults and dug tunnels. In July 1099, the decisive assault began. After fierce fighting, the Crusaders broke into the city. What happened next became one of the bloodiest pages in the history of the Middle Ages. The chronicles say that the blood in the streets reached the horses' knees. Muslims and Jews, residents without distinction, were slaughtered. The Crusaders considered this to be retribution and purification. Jerusalem was captured. Godfrey of Bouillon became ruler, but refused to bear the title of king in a city where, according to him, only Christ reigned. He called himself the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The First Crusade ended in spectacular success. In Europe, it was seen as a miracle. In the East, it was seen as a catastrophe. The Crusaders founded states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Anjou. But the victory only marked the beginning of a long and bloody history that lasted almost 200 years. After the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, a new political reality emerged in the East. For states were formed on the lands captured by the Crusaders, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Anjou, and the County of Edessa. Together, they are called the Latin East. The center of this system was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its ruler was Godfrey of Bouillon, but he did not call himself king, but rather defender of the Holy Sepulchre. After his death, his successors took the title of king. These states were fragile. There were few crusaders, and they found themselves surrounded by a hostile population. Most of the inhabitants of the Holy Land were Muslims, as well as Eastern Rite Christians, whom the Latins did not always accept as allies. To maintain power, the Crusaders built castles. Soon, powerful fortresses rose above Palestine and Syria, Crac des Chevaliers, Bellevue, Kerrich. They were home to knights and garrisons that could withstand long sieges. New military orders began to play a special role. This is how the Templars and Hospitallers came into being. The Templars, from the word temple, lived in the former Temple of Solomon and considered themselves defenders of pilgrims. The Hospitallers began as a brotherhood that cared for the sick, but quickly turned into a military force. These orders were bound by oaths of allegiance, wore special clothing, a white cloak with a red cross for the Templars, and lived by strict rules. In the first decades after 1099, the Crusaders held their lands. But soon the Muslim world began to respond. While at the beginning of the 11th century the Muslims were divided into Sunnis and Shiites, Seljuks and Egyptian Fatimids, they gradually began to unite. The first warning sign was the fall of the County of Edessa in 1144. This blow shook Europe. For the first time, one of the Latin states had been destroyed. The response was the Second Crusade. The famous Bernard of Clairvaux, the spiritual leader of Europe, was the preacher of the new campaign. His words ignited the kings. Two monarchs led the campaign, King Louis VII of France and German Emperor Conrad III. This was the first time that the crusade was led by the rulers of the largest states in Europe. However, the campaign turned out to be a disaster. The German army was defeated in Asia Minor. The French army barely made it to Anjou and Jerusalem. The attempt to take Damascus in 1148 failed. The Crusaders retreated with heavy losses. This came as a shock to Europe. The Second Crusade showed that war in the East was not only a religious impulse, but also a difficult military undertaking requiring discipline and strategy. Meanwhile, a new leader was rising in the East, Saladin. After the failure of the Second Crusade, the situation in the Holy Land changed dramatically. The Muslim world ceased to be fragmented. A new leader appeared on the horizon, Salah ad-Din, known in Europe as Saladin. Saladin came from a Kurdish family. He began his career as a military commander at the court of the Egyptian Sultan, but soon became the de facto ruler of Egypt. His talent lay not only in military art, but also in diplomacy. He managed to unite Egypt and Syria, and then other lands. For the first time in many decades, the Muslims of the Middle East acted as a united front. In 1187, Saladin dealt a decisive blow to the Crusaders. At the Battle of Hattin, his troops surrounded the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders suffered from heat and thirst, and their formation fell apart. At the decisive moment, the Muslim cavalry crushed the enemy. Thousands of prisoners fell into the hands of Saladin, including the King of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan. The relic, the cross on which Christ was supposedly crucified, was captured by the Muslims. This loss shook the Christian world. After his victory, Saladin easily took Jerusalem. But unlike the cruelty of the Crusaders in 1099, he showed mercy. He allowed the inhabitants to leave the city for a ransom and spared those who could not pay. For Muslims, he became a hero; for Christians, a terrible enemy, but at the same time a worthy opponent. News of the fall of Jerusalem spread throughout Europe. It caused a huge shock. The Pope called for a new crusade. Thus began the Third Crusade. 3 great monarchs took part in it: the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the French King Philip II Augustus, and the English King Richard I, known as the Lionheart. Frederick Barbarossa led a huge German army, but tragically died on the way through Asia Minor. He drowned in a river. His army, deprived of its leader, fell apart. Philip II and Richard the Lionheart arrived by sea. But already in the Holy Land, quarrels began between them. The French king soon returned home, leaving Richard as commander-in-chief. Richard the Lionheart was one of the most prominent knightly kings of his time. He was a brave warrior and a talented commander. His campaigns against Saladin became legendary. In 1191, Richard captured the port city of Acre after a difficult siege. The victory was accompanied by cruelty. He ordered the execution of the captured Muslims. This was followed by the famous Battle of Arsuf. Saladin's army attacked the Crusaders as they marched along the coast. Richard maintained iron discipline. His knights withstood the onslaught and only counterattacked at his signal. The result was devastating. Saladin's troops retreated. Despite his successes, Richard was unable to recapture Jerusalem. His army was exhausted, and the road home beckoned. England was facing political difficulties. In 1192, he made peace with Saladin. Under the treaty, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christians were allowed to make pilgrimages to holy sites. Thus ended the Third Crusade. It did not achieve its main goal, but it restored Europe's sense of power and gave rise to legends about Richard and Saladin, 2 leaders who respected each other even in war. Several years passed after the end of the Third Crusade. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, and calls for a new campaign were increasingly heard in Europe. At the beginning of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III announced a new crusade. Its goal was again Jerusalem, but reality took a different path. In 1202, the Crusader armies gathered in Venice. The plan was simple: sail south, land in Egypt, and from there strike the Holy Land. But the Crusaders did not have enough money to pay for the Venetian fleet. The Venetians, led by Doge Enrico Dandolo, offered a deal. First, the Crusaders would help Venice capture the city of Zadar in Dalmatia, and then they would sail on. Zadar was a Christian city, and when the Crusaders attacked it, it caused horror throughout Europe. Pope Innocent excommunicated them, but the campaign continued. The next step was even more disastrous. The Byzantine prince Alexius, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, arrived at the Crusader camp. He promised that if the Crusaders helped him regain the throne, he would give them gold, food, and military support for their campaign to Jerusalem. The Crusaders agreed. Instead of Egypt, their ships sailed to Constantinople. In 1203, they laid siege to the Byzantine capital, stormed it, and placed Alexius on the throne. But soon the situation changed. Discontent began in the city, and a rebellion broke out. Alexius was killed. The Crusaders were left without the promised reward. They decided to take it by force. In April 1204, the Crusader army stormed Constantinople. What happened next became one of the most terrible disasters in the history of Eastern Europe. For 3 days, the city was subjected to looting and destruction. Palaces, temples, libraries, everything was plundered. The shrine of the Orthodox world, the Hagia Sophia, was desecrated. According to eyewitnesses, soldiers broke into monasteries, tore down icons, trampled on sacred objects, and burned buildings. Priceless works of art and relics were taken to Europe. Many of them are still in Venice, in St. Mark's Cathedral. On the site of the Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders created the Latin Empire with its capital in Constantinople. But this entity proved to be weak. It lasted only a few decades, and Byzantium was restored, but already greatly weakened. The Fourth Crusade did not achieve its goal. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, and instead, the ally of the Christian world, Byzantium, was destroyed. This wound never healed. The Muslim East saw this as proof that the Crusaders had come not for the sake of faith, but for profit. Europe lost its moral authority, and relations between Catholics and Orthodox Christians were damaged for centuries. Several decades passed after the disaster of the Fourth Crusade. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Europe could not accept this and was preparing for another campaign. At the beginning of the 13th century, it became clear that the key to the Holy Land lay in Egypt. It was there that the military and economic power of the Muslims was concentrated. Whoever took Egypt would be able to dictate terms in Jerusalem. In 1217, the Fifth Crusade began. An army from Europe landed in Egypt and laid siege to the city of Damietta, a strategically important fortress on the Nile. The siege was long and difficult. In 1219, the Crusaders took the city. It was a success, but disaster awaited them further on. The Crusaders marched on Cairo. But the flooding of the Nile turned the area into a swamp. The Egyptians destroyed the dams, and the army was trapped. Disease, hunger, and enemy attacks led to the deaths of a huge number of people. In the end, the Crusaders surrendered and were forced to leave Egypt, losing everything they had captured. The Fifth Crusade ended in complete failure. A few years later, Europe made a new attempt. This time, the focus was on Frederick II Hohenstaufen, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He was an unusual ruler, educated, fond of science, knowledgeable in Arabic, and respectful of Eastern culture. Frederick II delayed the campaign for a long time, for which he was even excommunicated from the church. But in 1228, he finally set out for the Holy Land. His crusade went down in history as the only one in which almost no blood was shed. Frederick II used diplomacy. He began negotiations with Sultan Al-Kamil, the nephew of Saladin. At that moment, it was advantageous for the Sultan to make peace. He had problems within his own country. In 1229, a treaty was signed. Jerusalem was handed over to the Christians, while the Muslims were allowed to keep their holy sites. Frederick II entered Jerusalem without a fight. He placed the crown of the King of Jerusalem on his own head, although the Pope did not recognize his actions. Thus, the Sixth Crusade achieved its goal through peace rather than war. But the success was temporary. Within a few years, the Muslims recaptured Jerusalem. In the 13th century, Europe was once again swept up in the idea of a crusade. This time, the inspiration came from the French King Louis IX, who went down in history as Louis the Saint. He was a deeply religious monarch who saw the Crusades not only as a political move, but also as a sacred duty. In 1248, the Seventh Crusade began. Louis assembled a huge army and sent it to Egypt, believing that this was the key to Jerusalem. The army landed at Damietta and easily captured the city. This inspired confidence, but then difficulties began. The Crusaders moved deeper into Egypt and encountered fierce resistance. At Mansoura, their troops were surrounded. Disease, lack of food and water weakened the army. Louis IX himself was taken prisoner. He was ransomed for a huge sum, but the campaign ended in humiliating defeat. However, the king did not give up on his dream. 20 years later, he set out on another campaign, the Eighth Crusade of 1270. This time, the target was Tunisia. Louis hoped to convert the local ruler to Christianity and use Tunisia as a base for new attacks on Egypt. But the plan failed at the very beginning. An epidemic broke out in the Crusaders' camp. Louis himself fell ill and died under the walls of Tunis. With his death, the last great enthusiasm for the Crusades faded. Europe was disappointed by the endless failures. Meanwhile, a new force was growing in the east, the Mamluks, the military rulers of Egypt. They managed to finally drive out the Crusaders. In 1291, Acre, the last major Christian stronghold in Palestine, fell. After that, the Crusades to the Holy Land came to an end. The Crusades lasted for almost 200 years. They did not achieve their main goal. The holy city of Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. But their influence on Europe and the Middle East was enormous. Trade and economy. The main consequence was the development of trade. The Crusaders opened up new routes between the East and the West. Spices, silk, precious stones, and medicines began to flow from Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor to Europe. Europeans discovered sugar, citrus fruits, rice, and new fabrics. This trade enriched Italian cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. They became maritime powers that controlled the Mediterranean Sea. Impact on cities and crafts. European cities grew and strengthened. Demand for Eastern goods stimulated crafts. Blacksmiths, weavers, and shipbuilders received new orders. The monetary economy became more important than barter. Along with goods, knowledge also spread to the West. Through the Arabs, Europeans became acquainted with the works of ancient philosophers and scientists. Mathematics, medicine, and astronomy received a new impetus. Culture and ideas. The Crusades introduced Europe to the more developed culture of the East. The Crusaders saw rich cities, palaces, and universities. They realized that the world was bigger than their native villages and castles. This sparked an interest in travel and knowledge. Later, this experience would become the foundation for the Renaissance. Politics and the papacy. The Pope tried to use the Crusades to establish his leadership in the Christian world. But failures and scandals, especially the sacking of Constantinople, undermined the authority of the papacy. Monarchs strengthened their positions. The Crusades showed that kings could lead large numbers of people, collect taxes, and organize armies. This accelerated the formation of centralized states. Impact on the East. For Muslims, the Crusades were a test, but also an incentive for unification. Under the leadership of Saladin and then the Mamluks, the Islamic world managed to fight back and emerge stronger. But there were also losses. The cities of Syria and Palestine suffered from endless wars. Trade routes were destroyed, and the population perished. Military orders. The Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights became symbols of the Crusades. Their fortresses still tower over the eastern hills. The Knights Templar became wealthy and an influential force in Europe. But later, their power aroused envy and fear, and in the 14th century, the order was destroyed by the French King Philip IV. The Hospitallers continued to exist later, first in Rhodes, then in Malta, where they became defenders of the Mediterranean Sea. The Crusades became a school of warfare for Europe. For 2 centuries, knights fought in scorching deserts, stormed cities, built fortresses, and encountered Eastern tactics. All this changed the art of warfare in the Middle Ages. Castles and fortresses. The Crusaders built dozens of powerful fortresses in the East. The most famous of these was Crac des Chevaliers in Syria. This castle of the Knights Hospitaller towered over the hills, its walls and towers almost impregnable. Contemporaries said that the fortress could withstand the siege of any army. Crusader castles differed from their European counterparts. They had thicker walls, round towers, and complex systems of gates and moats. These innovations later spread throughout Europe and made medieval castles even more powerful. The art of siege warfare. The Crusades were a school of siege warfare. The Crusaders learned to build giant towers, battering rams, and catapults. They adopted the skills of the Arabs and Byzantines in the use of fire, tunneling, and engineering structures. The sieges of Ansh, Jerusalem, and Damietta became examples of perseverance and engineering genius. Later, this experience came in handy in Europe, where castles became the mainstay of power. Tactics and the army. European knights were accustomed to fighting on open plains, where the strength of heavy cavalry was decisive. In the East, they encountered new tactics. The light cavalry of the Muslims used quick attacks, bows, and maneuvers. The Crusades taught the knights discipline. They realized that they could not rush into battle without the support of the infantry. The army became more organized, and the interaction between the cavalry and the infantry improved. Naval power. Italian cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa played an important role. Their fleets transported armies, supplied troops, and blockaded cities. It was during the Crusades that the idea of a Crusader fleet, a united naval force, was born. Knights' orders. Military orders were formed in the East: the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights. They became symbols of the era. Their discipline, organization, and wealth made them a formidable force. The Templars guarded roads and pilgrims, the Hospitallers combined caring for the sick with warfare, and the Teutonic Knights brought their experience of the Crusades to the Baltic region, starting wars against the pagans in northern Europe. The image of the warrior of Christ. The Crusades gave rise to a new ideal of knighthood, the warrior of Christ. In Europe, knighthood was associated with honor, service to one's lord, and the pursuit of glory. In the East, a sacred mission was added to this, to defend the faith and liberate holy sites. This image persisted for centuries. Even after the end of the Crusades, knights dreamed of new expeditions, and writers and poets sang of their exploits. Symbols and signs. The cross became the main symbol of the Crusades. Knights sewed it onto their cloaks and shields. White, red, and black crosses distinguished between orders and troops. The symbolism of the Crusades became deeply ingrained in European culture. It persisted even after the military expeditions had ended. The Crusades left a deep mark not only on politics and warfare, but also on everyday life in Europe. Over 200 years of contact with the East changed Europe in terms of lifestyle, culture, and worldview. Food and habits. New products came from the East: rice, lemons, oranges, dates, watermelons. Europeans were introduced to sugar, which they called white gold. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, became a symbol of wealth. They were so highly valued that they were often used as money. Cooking changed. Dishes with Eastern spices and sweets made from honey and sugar appeared on the tables of the nobility. These habits took root and became part of European cuisine.